In the present day, women in religious orders in the U.S. have had to face the outright censure of an ecclesiastical hierarchy in their resistance to these priorities. As you may have heard, the Vatican undertook a procedural inquiry of women religious that suggested disciplinary action against liberal activist congregations. In addition, the Maryknoll Sisters, like all women's congregations in the U.S., is an aging population, and end-of-life care is as much on the agenda as foreign mission. Nevertheless, Maryknoll has not muted its advocacy, and its members remain dedicated to the pastoral field even as they enter their 70s and 80s. New areas of interest like environmentalism and HIV ministry have been incorporated into the long-standing fields of education, health, and advocacy for social justice. So to conclude, the story of the long Red Scare might be a depressing one to liberal Christians. Hewing to religious beliefs made some of these women enemies of the state. But there's a lot of inspirational moments when I conducted this research, and getting to know women who were involved in the YWCA and the Maryknoll Sisters, I took heart from the way in which they continued to draw from their own powerful organizational heritages of activism, the heritage of women's social justice work, and of the power of the inspiration of liberal religious thought to make a better world. And so whether their voices come through loudly or, as is now the case, more softly in our current political clamor, these women continue to carry forward a tradition that reshaped the role and capacity of women inside and outside of the churches in 20th century America. Thank you.
Amanda, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's really, really refreshing. And I was thinking, what is the vision of the sister about the new generation of women, and how many young women are getting involved in the movement now, and how strong is the legacy? How do you think this sister are communicating this legacy to the new generation of women? The sister. The new sister.
Well, when I was conducting my research a couple of years ago, I got to witness them taking their crop of sisters taking their final vows, and it was a group of 3. And that's pretty typical, 3 a year. And none of the women were from the United States. So I think that the sisters are not trying to, the anomaly is that religious vocations were so populous at the mid-century, and now they've trickled down to these small numbers. And I don't think they have the expectation that they're ever going to regain that type of population in their ranks. But in terms of their legacy, I think that they're very optimistic that the spirit, the Maryknoll spirit, will continue in those one-to-one encounters, that even, the 3 sisters a year, that this still allows them to carry on the spirit of their founders. So that I don't know, sisters strike me as a very optimistic group of people in general, women religious, that they seem quite happy with the state of the congregation and with the quality of the women who enter it. That they're very dedicated to the ideals of the founder.
Maybe can we pause here while you're walking by, and then we'll give Suzanne and the next one. Give the microphone to.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks so much. It's a really great paper. I'm trying to get my mind around a kind of virtual history question, that if the long Red Scare had not existed, if the Soviet Union somehow was out of the equation and the Cold War was out of the equation, how do you think this would have played out among these groups? Do you think there would still have been the same a degree of, a kind of liberal, conservative, left and right, pro-state, anti-state, whole range of things? In other words, what kind of energy does the Red Scare supply? I mean, is that the thing that really fuels the heat and animosity, or do you think that, absent that, these things were there anyway? And I guess a sort of follow-up question from that is that in these organizations, do conservative theological and conservative political positions always line up? Or are there people, evangelicals within the YWCA, who are supporting liberal causes or even left-wing causes? And similarly within the Mary Knoll Sisters, is there always a lineup between conservative Catholic doctrine and dogma and conservative political ideas?
Well, let's see, start with I think that evangelicals abandoned the YWCA quite early in its history, and this was happening as that split, the modernist fundamentalist split was happening, that the YWCA was no longer an organization that was doing the things they wanted to do, that the YWCA was really expanding in the direction of social Christianity. And so I don't think that the theology of the YWCA, women who were involved with the YWCA for religious reasons, I don't think that evangelicals were a big factor after, say, 1920 or so. Mary Knoll, I do think that that alignment is not as precise. I think that there are women, well, I know that there are women that were not happy with the turn towards public advocacy, and that the changes in the congregation troubled them, but that, that really what happened in the 1970s, the early 1980s, that they stuck with the congregation, and that there's the intensity, the visibility of Mary Knoll as a force for kind of left-wing theology has faded away. And so I think that those were difficult years for them, but that it's settled some. So as for if the energy of the Red Scare wasn't there, I think that would have been, that the fate of the YWCA would have been very different. I'm not so sure about Mary Knoll, but I think that the perils of the Red Scare and the dangers it posed to the YWCA's financial standing forced a leadership contingent into retreat that they would have rather not, a move they would have rather not taken. And the concerns of the national staff had not necessarily reflected the commitments of the large membership, but they saw the apparatus of the national organization as a way of publicizing these issues, that they didn't have that at their disposal after these Red Scare attacks. And so it meant that a piece of programming that had been crucial to the YWCA in the first half of the 20th century, its program for political advocacy and its voter education efforts, was no longer there. And so I think that really changed the nature of the organization.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a fascinating talk, and I also thought it was a model of how to look at groups like this, other kinds of groups as well. So I appreciate the way you presented it. And I just wanted to ask you something that's not part of this in a sense, but just in terms of a larger framework, I'm just wondering if you were advising someone who was teaching a class on American religion, how would you want them to perhaps alter the nature of the narrative based on this? And I guess in that connection also with women's history, I suppose my frustration or my sadness comes from the sense of constant, marvelous efforts by extraordinary women who were then somehow defeated or at least marginalized. And that pattern recurs so often. And I try so hard to break out of it. And I look for ways of not presenting a lachrymose women's history. And so I wonder if you could think of a way of presenting this that wouldn't be lachrymose in a sense. But I'm going to see the vitality and the vibrancy and the brilliance of it, definitely.
No, that's
but do
really...
you see this as a story of of an effort that was defeated or transformed in some way, perhaps, could you say? How would you present it?
I don't know. Those are great. I mean, those are things I grapple with too. And I don't want to tell this as a story of defeat. I mean, one way to tell it is the glorious rise of evangelical women, right? So I don't know. I'm actually curious how you would contend with that. I mean, well, you know, one thing is that liberal Christianity hasn't died, you know, and maybe the rise of evangelicals, there is more diversity than maybe our than the popular imagination would have you believe. And so there, I mean, certainly are, like, you could bring in nuns on the bus. And Sister Simone Campbell mobilized around the last couple of elections, a group of sisters going from state to state promoting Obamacare and immigration reform, things like that, so that that type of Christian politics doesn't get much play, but it's still there. It's there to be found, and it's, you know, not as visible as, say, the YWCA was in 1920, but it doesn't mean it isn't still an effective pressure group in some ways. So I think that those, there are examples like that to be found. And I guess it's a matter of reframing the story. I mean, if you, yeah, I'm sorry.
I guess what would worry me is, let's say, imagine me as a very right-wing person, very anti-communist. I could come up and say, in some sense, I could imagine, what would anti-communist McCarthyite people want as their enemy? What would be a more perfect enemy than this? They're women, they're nuns, they have their own trouble within the church to begin with, et cetera, et cetera. What a perfect enemy. And so in some way, I wouldn't want to say this ever, but one could say, some awful person could say, they fed right into a McCarthyite era, played right into their hands by what they did, how they did it, et cetera, et cetera. They were just the right enemy to bolster a McCarthyite approach. Do you see what I mean? That's what, I don't want to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't quite know how to, I'm sorry, I can't.
Let's see. Let's pass it back there and then over to Dan and Susan.
I mean, if you're talking about the Maryknolls, though, I'm a little confused whether we're talking about the Maryknolls or we're talking about the Young Women's Christian Association, because I think they are somewhat distinct. I think the Maryknolls were very much influenced, very much inspired by liberation theology and similar types of theology that existed like in Italy. And I don't think that development of that theology, I think, grew very much out of class inequality. I don't think it's ideologically directly reflecting the Cold War. I think it would have developed without the Cold War. I know, speaking with some Maryknoll nuns, so maybe in the early 80s, they told me, well, I think if I were young now, I think if I were a teenager and choosing a profession, I think now I would become a social worker. But at that time, for a young Catholic woman, working class very often, this was really what you did if you wanted to help people. You went into, became a nun. So I just want to offer that as a thought.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, if I could chime in that,
Yeah, if you just pass the microphone down this way.
I think that, you know, liberation theology, as it's often told, seems to come out of nowhere, and it's like all of a sudden we have activist nuns. But I'm trying to, in my work, kind of connect it to their earlier mission, and their small group, the emphasis on kind of small group education is something that went way back, and it turns into base ecclesial communities and kind of in conscientization that this stuff had been part of Maryknoll's practice, and then this gave it a new framework.
Amanda, I'm Dan Horowitz. As you know, I am not now and never have been a card-carrying women's historian. I think you can answer some of the other questions this way, or I want you to think about it, which is that the women in the Y, the Protestant women in the Y, gave in more easily or were less resistant. And it seems to me in what you're saying, the Maryknoll women, and I wonder if you can explain why, were more resistant, more consistent, didn't hide as much in the 50s, and there's much more continuity in their politics. So if that's so, I wonder if you can explain why. Is it a Catholic Protestant? Is it
community
religious?
structures?
Yes, yeah,
I mean,
well,
would it be community structures? Because, I mean, the YWCA was a voluntary organization that had to depend on outsiders to keep it going. So with the Maryknoll Sisters, I mean, they're an independent congregation, so they're not beholden to a bishop. They don't have to answer to that. They have their own structures of governance. So they didn't, what could you take from them? I guess, they did lose, they got a lot of criticism, a lot of flack. They did lose fundraising, but it doesn't stop them from being a religious institute.
Well, I just, speaking of nuns in general, as we know in the 60s and beyond, they not only got fewer and fewer new enrollees, but they also had people leaving in massive droves, and a lot of this had to do with the women's movement. And if I could, for a minute, pretend that Mary Daly was here, I think she might say, this is really good that there aren't any more Maryknolls, because it's still a patriarchal religion with a male head, and you can do these good works any way you choose without God or Christ. So that would be another way of saying this is good that they're gone, even though they themselves are good, but as an order and as a structure in society.
Well, and if I could point to one of my, I don't know, Maryknoll Sisters are great, but like there was a great book in 1984, created quite a splash in Catholic circles, Lesbian Nuns, and it was edited by two ex-Maryknoll women, that they're out in the forefront in so many ways, so.
I wanted to follow up on that and ask you to think or share with us a little more your thoughts on the implications and interconnections between the story you've told and the way we usually think about and teach the revival of second wave feminism. Because I think there are implications and interconnections there, and I'd be curious about how you see them and how they might factor into the study that you're doing.
Well, it's kind of easy to talk about it in terms of Maryknoll because they were grappling with it at this time of Exodus. And it was one of the things that became a factor in, so the Vatican Council goes from 62 to 65. One of the things that comes out of it is that orders need to revisit their charism, their inspiration, and make a new plan about what is the foundation of their community. And so Maryknoll goes into its re-examination here, as missionaries and as women being affected by the women's movement. And so this plays into their debates over the habit, over community life, and about relationships with men. And there is some high-profile episodes of Maryknoll sisters marrying Maryknoll fathers. They had to add to their constitution that you would be expelled from the order if you got married, even in a civil marriage. Like, this is the point at which they needed to point that out. So I think that they directly grappled with it and they tried to adapt to it. They, they eliminated the habit. They changed community structures so that women could, get their education on their own, live on their own, things like that. But that it didn't, that women kept leaving nevertheless. So that they tried to incorporate some of the insights of the women's movement, but it wasn't effective in keeping women in religious life. Maryknoll Sisters continue to, I'd say it's got a strong component of feminism in its religious output, that I think they were receptive to feminism in the 1970s, and so that they've tried to build their community life based on a lot of that. The YWCA, I don't know, the institutional identity of the YWCA after the 1960s becomes pretty fragmented. But if you look at what YWCAs are doing today, I mean, you're talking about places that are generally child care providers, domestic violence shelters, Head Start providers, things like that. It seems to me that there's a very crucial relationship to feminism in the way that the YWCA has sustained itself. So I'm not sure what the precise links are, but I'm sure it's there.
Hi, Betsy Moore. I was wondering, you characterized the change in the YWCA's activities as one of declining political activism. At the same time, they were becoming more involved in civil rights activism. And I was wondering if that's actually a decline in political activism or more just a change in what its political activism was focusing on.
Definitely, that's definitely fair to say. That maybe decline is the wrong word, but it changes the scope and really focuses in on the civil rights movement, throws a lot of energy there, and so that becomes kind of its political program.
And was that less controversial than what its political activities were before?
I believe so. I mean, the head of the association, a couple of the different women that were heads of the association were very prominent leaders in the civil rights movement, particularly Dorothy Height. And and also the YWCA had been working on being an interracial organization, had been very, kind of putting that front and center since the 1920s. So it was not something within the YWCA that was a question anymore, although they had to expel Montgomery, a couple of different associations in 1964 that still hadn't desegregated after all those years. They had to expel them because of the Civil Rights Act. So I don't think it caused controversy within the association. I think that it had been decided that that was an institutional priority.
I wonder if I can follow up on Susan's question about how this relates to narratives of second wave feminism, and just maybe a couple of possible avenues into that question. One is about the notion of political agency not being seized, or not being ceded, but being seized from another component of the political spectrum. And the other is that seizing, you suggested in relation to Phyllis Schlafly, that it wasn't anti-women's rights, but it was anti-statism that was really propelling her. And is that something that we've lost in trying to understand then what becomes the very successful political organizing against women's rights, against the ERA and other initiatives, but that may be tied to other sources?
That's a very provocative thought. Yeah, I don't know how to follow through on it, though.
There's another question over
I'm disappointed to hear Reinhold Niebuhr playing the part that he does in your paper. And some of us are used to hearing him only in the most laudatory context. But I just wanted, he assailed the idea of love. I think that was your phrase. I would hope he would have at least said, could we develop this idea a little bit? It seems almost a little unlike him. Could you just say a word more about his role?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of, what is it, Moral Man and Immoral Society, 32 or so, where he's going out on the attack, and he's doing it as a straw man type of thing. So maybe by the maybe you could say more about this than me, that by the time we get to the post-war years, he's softened a little bit. But in the years I encounter him, and in fact, with his encounters with YWCA women, Rose Turlin was one of his students. And worked for him in his magazine Radical Religion with the Fellowship of Socialist Christians, as did another woman who makes her appearance in the FBI files, a YWCA woman. And so that's a moment at which he is, castigating the social gospel as very, this weak response to threats that need to be answered by more radical action. And so this is kind of where he and the YWCA part company. And after the Second World War, the YWCA still looks very much like a social gospel organization, whereas Niebuhr is focusing more on this kind of neo-orthodoxy and too of the aggressive liberal anti-communism, so that he and the YWCA look very different at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a gender dimension both to Niebuhr and also to Arthur Schlesinger, as you know. The vital center, which is this contrast between the tough-minded, it ends up with Kenny, but the tough-minded, masculine Christianity versus that kind of soft, dough-faced, which I think was Niebuhr's phrase. That is that what got us into the Popular Front and its aftermath got us into this weakened Christianity that opened the door to fascism and communism, and that what we needed was a vital center that was tough and masculine. And both Niebuhr and Schlesinger, as you know, participate in that. That might be worth thinking about.
Do you want a last word?
No.
Last question.
I don't want to leave without clarifying whether Bernie Becomes a Nun was serialized in Cosmopolitan, the Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
magazine. So Bertie was a Cosmo girl?
Yes, and the pictures taken for that were by George Barris, who is famous as the man who took the last pictures of Marilyn Monroe. So,
Well, the only thing I would want to mention at the end is that there, in terms of additional threads to include in the narrative going forward, is the coincidence of a certain kind of popularity in the 1970s and 80s for nuns. So you remember there was, I can't remember her name, had a huge hit with Heiress 2. So, nuns were sort of cool for a particular point of time. And the Maryknoll sisters who were murdered were seen as martyrs, and they were, largely indemnified against any of the attacks made by them, by people like Jean Kirkpatrick's, because the status that they occupied was seen as protected by the kind of, by their grounding in their religion. Yeah. So there was a certain autonomy to them when attacks came against them. So there was this kind of confluence of their popularity, their unusual standing in public life. I think that might, help to pivot them to nuns on the bus who occupied the same kind of position.
good, thank you.
I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this for a long time, because I really think that the narratives that you've offered us cause us to rethink what counts as politics, what counts in a whole lot of social movements that we thought we knew a lot about in 20th century America. So thank you so much, Amanda.